Sometimes the place you choose for peace becomes the place that changes everything. Mae Huxley bought an old logging cabin in the Wyoming mountains, thinking she'd finally found the quiet retirement she'd earned after 30 years as a fire lookout. But the cabin had other plans. The walls were covered in carvings, names, dates, warnings carved deep into the wood by people who'd vanished without a trace. The locals called it the Crowling Place and refused to talk about it. Mae thought she was starting a new chapter of her life. Instead, she opened a door to her own family's buried past. What happened in that cabin all those years ago? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The drive from Montana had taken 3 full days, and Mae's shoulders carried the weight of every mile. Her old pickup, loaded with everything she owned that mattered, 2 duffel bags of clothes, a box of books, cooking supplies, and her grandfather's hunting rifle, groaned up the final switchback as the October sun began its descent behind the peaks. The GPS had stopped working 20 miles back, leaving her with a hand-drawn map from Ranger Tommy Bridger and her own instincts honed from 3 decades of backcountry navigation. The cabin appeared suddenly around a bend, nestled in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines. Mae pulled to a stop and sat for a moment, engine ticking as it cooled, taking in what would be her home. The structure was older than Bridger had let on, weathered logs gone silver-grey with age, a stone chimney climbing one side, windows dark and watching. The porch sagged slightly on the left side, and the whole place had an air of patient waiting, as if it had been holding its breath for years. She'd paid cash for it, $12,000 for 5 acres and a 2-room cabin 40 miles from the nearest town. Bridger had seemed almost eager to close the deal, his young face brightening when she'd agreed to his asking price without negotiation. He'd handed over the keys, an old brass set that looked more decorative than functional, and told her the property had good bones and real character. Then he'd driven off quickly, dust trail marking his retreat down the mountain road. Mae had spent 30 years watching forests from fire towers. Solitude was her closest companion, silence her preferred conversation. She'd started the work fresh out of college, drawn to the idea of being alone with her thoughts and the wilderness. Her mother had called it running away from life. Mae called it finding peace. Now, at 62, with her knees starting to complain on cold mornings and her hands showing the honest wear of a life spent outdoors, she'd decided it was time for a different kind of solitude, one with 4 walls and a roof that didn't sway in the wind. The cabin key turned smoothly despite its age. The door opened with a creak that seemed to echo through the empty interior. Mae stood on the threshold, breathing in the smell of old wood, dust, and something else, the particular scent of a place that had been closed up for too long. She found the light switch by the door, but nothing happened. Of course, Bridger had mentioned the place was off-grid. Solar panels on the roof, he'd said, but they might need work. The interior revealed itself in the fading daylight, filtering through grimy windows. One main room served as kitchen and living area, with a cast-iron stove squatting in one corner, a dry sink along one wall, and a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs. A doorway led to what she assumed was the bedroom. The floor was solid, wide planks worn smooth by decades of footsteps, and the walls were the unfinished interior of the logs, chinked with what looked like original mortar, and covering nearly every inch of those walls were carvings. Mae moved closer, running her fingers over the grooves cut into the wood. Names mostly. J. Peterson near the doorframe, Lyle S. above the sink, Remember Us carved in elaborate script near the ceiling. Dates scattered throughout, 1952, 1953. Some messages were longer, harder to read in the dimming light. She'd known the cabin was old, had assumed it might have graffiti or the marks of previous occupants. But this felt different, intentional, urgent. She pushed the unsettled feeling aside. There would be time to examine the walls properly. Right now, she needed to get her supplies inside before full dark, find the water pump Bridger had mentioned, and figure out the lighting situation. The next 2 hours passed in the practical rhythm of making camp. Mae hauled in her belongings, located the hand pump at the kitchen sink that drew from a well beneath the cabin, and discovered a cache of oil lamps in a cupboard. She filled and lit 3 of them, their warm glow pushing back the shadows and making the space feel almost cozy. The cast-iron stove had a good draw once she got it going, and she heated water for coffee and a simple meal of canned soup and bread. As she ate at the wooden table, Mae allowed herself to really look at the carvings in the lamplight. They were everywhere, floor to ceiling, covering every wall. Some were crude, as if carved in haste. Others showed care, the letters perfectly formed and deeply etched. Near the stove, she found a series of marks that looked like a calendar, small notches grouped in 5s. She counted 23 groups. 115 days. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory. "You've always been good at being alone. Mae, sometimes I wonder if you know how to be anything else." They'd had that conversation 5 years ago, shortly before her mother died. It had been meant as criticism, but Mae had taken it as simple observation. She was good at being alone. She preferred it. After her mother's funeral, Mae had returned to her tower in Montana and felt relief at the familiar isolation. But sitting in this cabin, surrounded by the carved testimony of people long gone, Mae felt something she rarely experienced, a whisper of doubt about her chosen path. These carvings spoke of people who'd been here, who'd marked their presence deliberately. Why? What had driven them to leave their names like this? She washed her few dishes, banked the fire in the stove, and moved to the bedroom. It was smaller than the main room, with a narrow bed frame built against one wall, no mattress, and a small dresser. The walls here bore fewer carvings, but the ones present were more personal. "Missing home," near the window. "Cold tonight by the door." "They're not coming," in letters so deeply carved they'd taken real time and effort. Mae spread her sleeping bag on the bed frame, grateful she'd brought camping gear. Tomorrow she'd drive to Prospect, the nearest town, and get proper supplies. A mattress, food beyond canned goods. Maybe someone who could tell her about this place's history. She lay in her sleeping bag, the cabin settling around her with the soft creaks and sighs of old wood. Through the bedroom window, stars blazed in the mountain darkness with the clarity that only comes from true remoteness. This was what she'd wanted, a place beyond the reach of the modern world's noise, where she could live out her remaining years in peace. But as sleep began to claim her, Mae found herself thinking about the carvings, about the urgency in some of them, about the way their not coming had been carved so deep the wood around it had splintered. She slept. The sound woke her sometime after midnight. 3 distinct knocks, a pause, then 3 more. Mae lay still, listening. She'd spent enough time in backcountry structures to know the sounds of wood expanding and contracting, of wind against boards, of small animals in the walls. This was none of those things. 3 knocks, deliberate and measured. Pause. 3 more. She sat up, reaching for the flashlight she'd placed beside the bed. The knocking stopped. Mae waited, breathing quietly, listening to the profound silence of the mountains. Nothing. She lay back down, chalking it up to the house settling, to her own unfamiliarity with this particular structure's quirks. The knocking came again. 3, pause 3. Closer this time, or seeming to be. Mae got up, pulling on her boots and jacket. She took her flashlight and moved through the cabin, checking windows, the front door. The back door, she'd discovered, led to a small covered porch. Everything was secure. Outside, nothing moved in the cone of her flashlight. The forest stood silent under the stars. She returned to bed, but sleep came fitfully. The knocking didn't return, but Mae found herself listening for it, tensed against the silence. Morning brought rationality. Mae rose at first light, made coffee, and stood on the front porch watching the sun paint the peaks gold. The cabin looked benign in daylight, just an old structure with character, exactly what she'd wanted. The knocking had been nothing. All places made sounds. She'd spent enough time in fire towers to know that. She spent the morning exploring her property. The 5 acres were mostly wooded, with a small creek running along the western edge. She found the solar panel array on the roof, older panels, probably in need of updating. Behind the cabin, a small storage shed leaned at an angle, filled with rusted tools and empty glass bottles. Evidence of the cabin's logging camp past. It was while searching the storage shed that Mae found the brass compass. It lay in the ashes of what appeared to be a small burn pile, old papers and wood scraps, long since consumed. The compass was old, heavy in her hand, its face marked with verdigris but still readable. Engraved on the back in elegant script, E.H. 1952, Mae turned it over in her palm, feeling the weight of it. Someone had valued this once, had carried it, used it, had lost it or left it behind. She slipped it into her pocket and headed back to the cabin, ready to make the drive to Prospect. Time to learn what she could about the Crowling Place and the people who'd carved their stories into its walls. The third night changed everything. Mae had spent the day in Prospect, a town that seemed to exist primarily out of stubbornness. One main street, a general store, a post office, a diner, and not much else. The people had been polite enough when she'd bought supplies, a mattress strapped to her truck bed, groceries, propane for the stove, until she'd mentioned where she lived. Up at the old logging cabin, she'd said to the clerk at the general store, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes. About 40 miles northeast, the woman's hands had stilled on the cash register. The Crowling Place. I suppose so. I bought it from Ranger Bridger last month. The store had gone quiet. Mae had felt the weight of stares, the sudden cessation of the low conversations that had been murmuring in the background. The clerk had finished the transaction quickly, not meeting Mae's eyes, and the next customer had stepped up as if Mae had become invisible. She'd tried the diner next, hoping for information and a hot meal. The waitress had been friendly enough until Mae asked if anyone knew the cabin's history. "Can't help you," the woman had said, though her expression suggested otherwise. As Mae left, she'd heard an elderly woman at the counter whisper, "Poor thing." God help her. The library had been more helpful, if only slightly. Phyllis Kern, the librarian, had shown her a microfiche of a 1957 newspaper article. Search called off at Crowling Logging Camp. The article had been frustratingly vague. Multiple. Missing persons, presumed dead. Search abandoned after 2 weeks due to difficult terrain and weather. No names listed, no details about what had happened or why so many had vanished. "Strange business, that," Phyllis had said, peering at Mae over her reading glasses. "My mother used to talk about it sometimes, said the whole thing was covered up. In corporate scandal, she thought, but nobody knows for sure." Mae had driven home with more questions than answers, unease settling in her stomach like a stone. Now, past midnight on her third night, the knocking had returned. 3 deliberate raps. Pause. 3 more. Mae lay in her new mattress, listening. The pattern repeated, regular as a heartbeat. She rose and followed the sound through the darkened cabin, oil lamp in hand. The knocking seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, not from outside, but from within the walls themselves. Mae stood in the main room, turning slowly, trying to locate the source. The carvings on the walls seemed to shift in the lamplight, shadows making the letters appear to move. And then she saw it. A section of wall near the kitchen sink she hadn't examined closely before. In the flickering light, what she'd thought was random scratching resolved into words. A journal entry carved in small, careful letters. January 15th, 1953. Food running low. We've been rationing for 2 weeks now. Bill keeps saying the supply trucks will come, but the pass is snowed in solid. Some of the men are talking about trying to walk out. I told them to wait. The company knows we're here. They'll send help. Mae moved closer, her lamp illuminating more text carved below. January 22nd, 1953. Still no supplies. The men voted. 11 of them are going to try for Prospect on foot. I tried to talk them out of it, but they're desperate. I gave them what I could from my own rations. God keep them safe. Her hands were shaking as she traced the carved letters. This wasn't graffiti or idle marking of time. This was testimony. Someone had used these walls to record what was happening. She searched the walls with new eyes, finding more entries scattered throughout the room. February 1st, 1953. The men who left haven't come back. We keep watching the road, but there's nothing. Just snow and silence. February 8th, 1953. Down to 1 meal a day. Burning the furniture to stay warm. I don't know how much longer we can hold out. Mae felt her chest tighten. She was reading someone's final days, carved into wood because there was no paper, no way to send a message. Nothing but these walls and the determination to leave a record. She searched the walls methodically now, finding names carved high near the ceiling, 11 of them accompanied by dates in January. The men who'd left and never returned. Near the floor, she found more names, 12 this time, with dates in February and March. Those who'd stayed. The knocking came again, 3 and 3, and Mae understood suddenly it wasn't knocking at all. It was the sound of a chisel against wood, the rhythm of someone carving. A memory echo, perhaps, or her own mind trying to make sense of what she'd discovered. She spent the rest of the night documenting what she found. She used paper and pencil to make rubbings of the clearest entries, photographing others with her old film camera. By dawn, she had a rough timeline of what had happened in the winter of 1952 and 1953. 23 men had been here. Supplies had stopped coming. 11 had tried to walk out. None had returned. The remaining 12 had waited, starved, and, based on the dates, died one by one through February and into March. The last entry she found was the hardest to read. February 14th, 1953. They're not coming back. I know what happened now. God forgive me, I should have known. I should have made them stay. But I let them go, and now they're gone, and we're all that's left. Tell them. Someone find this and tell them what happened here. We weren't forgotten men. We had names. We had families. Tell them we were here. It was signed simply, E.H. Mae sat at the kitchen table as sunrise filled the cabin with pale light. She held the brass compass from the shed, turning it over to read the inscription again. E.H. 1952. Whoever E.H. was, he'd stayed until the end. He'd carved this testimony, this memorial, into the walls, and then he died here, alone, determined that someone would eventually read his words. Mae looked around the cabin with new understanding. This wasn't just an old logging camp, it was a tomb, a monument, a warning carved in wood, and everyone in Prospect knew it. She thought about the clerk's reaction, the whispered, "God help her," Phyllis's talk of corporate scandal and cover-up. They all knew something terrible had happened here. They knew, and they'd said nothing when Bridger sold her the property. Mae felt anger kindle in her chest, bright and hot. These men, E.H. and the 22 others, had died here. Their story had been carved into these walls for anyone to read. And for 70 years, no one had bothered to listen. She made fresh coffee and stood on the porch watching the forest wake up. The cabin didn't feel haunted now. It felt like a responsibility. E.H. had left his testimony hoping someone would find it, would care enough to tell the story. Mae had spent 30 years alone, watching and waiting. Maybe it was time to be seen, time to speak up. She would find out who E.H. was. She would learn the names of all 23 men, and she would make sure their story was finally told. The knocking, the sound of chisel on wood, didn't return that night or any night after. Mae understood why. E.H. had finally been heard. Mae approached the investigation like she'd approached 3 decades of fire-watching, with patience, attention to detail, and systematic method. She started by photographing every wall, every carving, working her way through 2 rolls of film in the process. Then she began making rubbings of the clearest entries, organizing them chronologically in a notebook she'd bought in Prospect. The cabin revealed itself slowly, layer by layer. She discovered that certain floorboards creaked more than others, and on the 3rd day of her systematic documentation, one board near the cast-iron stove gave way slightly under her weight. Mae knelt and examined it more closely. The board was loose, deliberately so. She worked her fingers into the gap and lifted. Beneath the floorboards, wrapped in oilcloth, was a ledger. Mae carried it to the kitchen table with careful hands. The oilcloth had protected it well. The leather cover was dry, the pages intact if yellowed with age. She opened it slowly. Crowling Timber Company, Winter Camp Ledger, 1952-1953, read the title page in careful handwriting. What followed were columns of names, dates, and wages. 23 men listed, each with a job title: faller, bucker, choker setter, cat skinner. Mae traced the names with her finger, feeling the weight of each one. These weren't just carved letters on a wall anymore. These were real people with job assignments and wages due. She cross-referenced the names with the carvings she'd documented. 12 matched exactly, the 12 names carved low on the walls, near the floor, the men who'd stayed. Another 11 matched the names carved high, near the ceiling, the men who'd walked out. But it was the notations, besides some names, that made Mae's blood run cold. Next to 11 names, the ones who'd tried to walk to Prospect, someone had written in red ink, "Departed early, January 24th, 1953. Beside another 8 names, the same red ink, transferred February 1953. Only 4 names had no notation. Mae checked them against the wall carvings and found them, including E.H., whose entries she'd been reading. The 4 who'd lasted longest. Mae sat back thinking. The terminology was clinical, bureaucratic. Departed early for men who'd walked into a blizzard and never returned. Transferred for men who died of starvation and exposure, as if they'd simply moved to another job site. Someone had updated this ledger after the fact, covering up deaths with administrative language. She paged through the rest of the book. Supply requisitions, equipment logs, production notes. Everything routine until January 1953, when a gap appeared. No entries for weeks. Then in March, a single line. Camp closed due to adverse conditions. Final payroll disbursed to families. Mae wondered how many of those families had actually received payment. How many had been told their husbands, fathers, sons had simply departed early or been transferred. She thought about her own family then, her mother, who'd died 5 years ago, her father, who'd left when Mae was young, her grandmother, whom she barely remembered. Mae had never been curious about her family history. She'd always been too busy looking forward or outward, never back. But now she wondered. Her mother's mother had been named Elizabeth. Elizabeth Huxley, though that was her married name. Her maiden name had been what? Mae tried to remember. Something uncommon. Something she'd seen once on an old family document. Crowling. Mae's hands stilled on the ledger. Her grandmother's maiden name had been Crowling. Same as the timber company. Same as the cabin's local name, the Crowling Place. She stood and walked to the wall where E.H.'s final entry was. Carved. E.H. February 14, 1953. The handwriting matched the ledger's title. Page. E.H. had kept the company records. E.H. had carved the testimony. Mae did the math. If her grandmother had been a Crowling, and if this was her family's company, then E.H. might be what? An uncle? Great-uncle? She needed more information. More records. She needed to go back to Prospect, back to Phyllis at the library, and dig deeper into her own family's past. But first, she had work to finish here. Mae spent the rest of the day documenting every page of the ledger, every notation, every name. She created a master list of all 23 men with whatever information she could gather from the records and the wall carvings. As evening approached, Mae found herself speaking aloud to the cabin. "Egbert, if you're family, I need you to know I'm listening now. I'm going to find out what really happened. I'm going to tell your story properly." The cabin creaked softly in the cooling air, a sound Mae had come to recognize as the wood settling after a day in the sun. But she let herself imagine it was acknowledgement, agreement. That night, Mae made a simple dinner and sat at the table with her notes spread around her. She'd spent 30 years in isolation, convincing herself that solitude was enough. But reading these men's final messages, understanding that E.H. had stayed to the end to record their story, Mae felt something shift inside her. Connection mattered. Memory mattered. These men had died alone in this cabin, but E.H. had made sure they wouldn't be forgotten. He'd stayed, carved their names, recorded their story, and died in the attempt to preserve their memory. Mae had spent her life as an observer, watching from a distance. Maybe it was time to be a participant. To step down from the tower and into the story, she looked at E.H.'s final entry again. "Tell them we were here." "I will," Mae promised the empty cabin. "I will tell them." The next morning, Mae packed up her notes and documentation. She locked the cabin carefully. It felt important now, like protecting a sacred site, and drove the long road to Prospect. She had names to research, records to find, and a family history to uncover. The library was empty when she arrived. Phyllis looked up from her desk with something like relief when Mae walked in. "I wondered if you'd come back," the older woman said. "I need to know everything," Mae told her. "About the Crowling Timber Company, about the winter of 1952-1953, and about the Crowling family." Phyllis nodded slowly. "I thought you might follow me. I've been doing some digging myself since you were here last. I think you should see what I found." She led Mae to the library's small archive room, where file boxes were stacked on metal shelves. Phyllis pulled one down and opened it on the table. "Birth and death records," she said. "Newspaper clippings. Property deeds. Your cabin has quite a history, Mae, and I think you're right. I think you have a very personal connection to it." Mae opened the first folder, and her grandmother's face looked back at her from an old photograph. Young, smiling, standing next to a man in logging clothes. "That's Elizabeth Crowling," Phyllis said softly. "Taken in 1951, and that man beside her is her brother, Ernest Huxley Crowling, the foreman at the winter camp, the man everyone called E.H." Mae stared at the photograph, her great-uncle's face looking back across 70 years. Ernest Huxley Crowling, E.H. The man who'd carved testimony into the cabin walls was her grandmother's brother. The cabin where she'd chosen to retire was the place where her own family had died. How did I not know this? Mae's voice came out hoarse. Phyllis settled into a chair across from her. "Did your mother ever talk about her family?" "Never. I knew my grandmother's name was Elizabeth, but she died when I was very young. My mother never mentioned her family history, never talked about her mother's side at all." Mae looked up from the photograph. "I assumed it was just typical family silence. Every family has things they don't discuss. This family had good reason." Phyllis opened another folder, revealing newspaper clippings yellowed with age. Ernest Crowling was the foreman at that winter camp. When the men disappeared, his name was all over the investigation. Some people blamed him for not getting the men out sooner. Others said he was a hero for staying with them. The whole thing was a mess. Mae pulled the clippings closer, reading quickly. The articles painted a confusing picture. Initial reports of missing loggers, search parties turned back by weather. Eventual discovery of the camp in spring with evidence of fatalities. But the details were vague, almost deliberately obscured. "Why so little information?" Mae asked. 23 men died. That should have been major news. It was for about a week. Then the story stopped. Company pressure, people said. Crowling Timber had lawyers, money, connections. They managed to keep most of the details out of the papers. Phyllis tapped one article. "This is the last one that ran, July 1953. Says the search was called off. All men presumed dead, families compensated. Case closed. But Ernest's death certificate," Mae said, remembering what she'd seen in the county records. It said July, cause of death exposure and hypothermia. How does someone die of hypothermia in July? Exactly the right question. Phyllis pulled out another document. "I found Ernest's death certificate in the archive. Official cause is listed as exposure, but there's a notation at the bottom from the examining physician. It says, remains consistent with death occurring approximately 4 to 5 months prior to discovery." Mae felt her stomach turn. "He died in February or March with the other men. But they didn't find him until July, and they dated his death certificate to match when he was found, not when he died. Cleaner that way. Less complicated." Phyllis's voice carried an edge of disgust. Everything about this case was covered up or simplified. The company wanted it to go away, and eventually it did. Mae gathered the documents, her hands shaking slightly. Birth records, death certificates, newspaper clippings, the photograph of Ernest and Elizabeth. Pieces of a story her family had kept buried for 70 years. "Can I make copies of these?" she asked. "Take them," Phyllis said. I've already made duplicates for the library archive. These are yours. Your family's history. Mae drove back to the cabin in a daze, the file box of documents on the seat beside her. She kept glancing at Ernest's photograph, seeing the family resemblance, her mother's eyes, her own stubborn jaw. This man who'd died alone in the cold, who'd spent his final days carving truth into wood, was her blood. At the cabin, Mae spread the documents across the kitchen table. She added them to her growing collection of notes and rubbings, creating a timeline of events. Ernest had been 25 when he died. Young, responsible for 22 men, trapped by circumstances he couldn't control. She walked to the wall where his journal entries were carved and read them again with new understanding. This wasn't a stranger's testimony anymore. This was family. Her great-uncle, speaking across generations, begging someone to listen. Mae found herself talking to him as she worked. I'm Elizabeth's granddaughter. Your sister's granddaughter. I'm listening now, Ernest. I hear you. She documented everything methodically, every name, every date, every carved message. 12 men had died in the cabin. She listed them: Ernest Huxley Crowling, Foreman Lyle Schneider, Fowler James Garrett, Bucker William Ross, Cat Skinner. The list continued. 11 more had died trying to walk to Prospect. She listed them too, mapping each name from the ledger to the carved memorial near the ceiling. As the afternoon faded, Mae discovered something she'd missed before. In the bedroom, carved small near the floor by the window, was a message she'd thought was just another date notation. Tell Elizabeth I tried. Mae knelt, tracing the letters with her fingers. Ernest's last thought had been of his sister, of making sure she knew he'd done his best, that he'd tried to save the men, tried to get them through the winter, tried to leave a record of what happened. Had Elizabeth ever known? Had her grandmother ever learned what happened to her brother? Mae's mother had never mentioned it, but maybe that was the point. Maybe knowing had been too painful. Maybe the family had chosen silence over grief. Mae pulled out her mother's old photograph album, which she'd brought with her from Montana. She'd packed it without much thought, just another box of belongings. Now she paged through it, looking for clues. There, near the back, was a picture of her grandmother as an old woman. 60 years old, maybe, standing in front of a house Mae didn't recognize. The woman's face was serious, eyes distant. Written on the back in her mother's handwriting, Mom, 1983. She never talked about her family. Mae understood now. Elizabeth had lost her brother to the winter of 1953, and she'd carried that grief silently for the rest of her life. She'd passed that silence to her daughter, who'd passed it to Mae. 3 generations of women who didn't talk about the past. But Ernest had made sure the past wasn't lost. He'd carved it into wood, preserved it behind floorboards, left clues for anyone willing to look. He died making sure the story survived. Mae stood in the cabin as evening light slanted through the windows. She thought about her 30 years in fire towers, watching for threats, sending warnings, protecting from a distance. Ernest had done something similar in his final days. He'd kept watch. He'd recorded what he saw. He'd tried to warn future generations about what corporate greed and negligence could do. I won't let your story end here, Mae said aloud. I'll make sure everyone knows what happened. I'll tell them about all 23 men. I'll tell them how you stayed to the end to give them a voice. I promise you, Ernest. I promise. The cabin settled around her with its evening creaks and sighs. Mae lit the oil lamps and made dinner, but her mind was already working on the next steps. She needed more information about the company, about what had really happened, about who was responsible. The truth was here, carved in wood and hidden in documents. Mae just needed to piece it all together. And she would. For Ernest. For the 22 men who died with him. For her grandmother, who'd lived with silent grief, Mae would break the silence. She would tell the story that had been buried for 70 years. Mae found the supply manifest 3 days later, nailed to the inside of a closet door she'd barely opened. The closet was narrow, more of a storage nook than anything else, and Mae had assumed it was empty. But something had nagged at her about the way the door hung, not quite flush with the frame. When she examined it more closely, she discovered a torn piece of paper fixed to the interior with old nails. Positioned, so it would be invisible unless someone opened the door fully and looked behind it. Mae carefully removed the nails and held the document up to the lamplight. Crowling Timber Company, Supply Manifest. Winter Delivery Schedule 1952-1953, read the header. What followed was a detailed list of provisions meant for the winter camp. Flour, coffee, salt pork, beans, medical supplies, blankets, fuel. Everything a crew of 23 men would need to survive an isolated winter in the mountains. The manifest showed 3 delivery dates, November 15th, December 15th, and January 15th, but stamped across the January delivery in red ink were the words, "Redirected per company directive. New destination. Billings Camp." Mae felt anger surge through her chest. The supplies had existed. They'd been ready. And someone at the company had deliberately sent them elsewhere, leaving Ernest and his crew to starve. She searched the closet more thoroughly and found 2 more documents wedged into a crack in the floorboards. Both were company memos, signed by someone named Vernon Hartley, operations director. The first, dated December 1952, discussed cost reduction measures and the need to consolidate resources at profitable sites. The second, from January 1953, was more explicit. Winter camp showing insufficient yield. Redirect all remaining supply shipments. Grew to be relocated in spring. When the pass cleared and they could get out. But that assumed the crew could survive until spring without supplies. Mae photographed every document, her hands trembling with rage. This wasn't negligence. This was abandonment. Ernest and his men had been sacrificed for cost savings. Left to die so the company could redirect resources to more profitable operations. She needed to know more about this Vernon Hartley and about the company's finances. Mae drove to Prospect again, becoming a regular fixture at the library. Phyllis had started pulling files before Mae even asked, anticipating her research needs. "I found something you need to see," Phyllis said when Mae walked in. She had several old newspaper editions spread across a table. "I went through the business section archives. Crowling Timber was in serious financial trouble in 1952. The articles painted a picture of a company in decline. Labor disputes, unpaid wages, safety violations, lawsuits. Mae learned that her great-grandfather, Ernest's father, had sold the company in 1951 to a group of investors led by Vernon Hartley. The sale had been described as retirement, but Mae suspected it was desperation. Look at this one from October 1952. Phyllis pointed to an article. 3 different logging camps were shut down that fall. Only one was kept operational through winter, the one Ernest was running. Why keep it open if they were cutting costs? Mae asked. "Read this." Phyllis handed her another document, a legal filing. The company had existing timber contracts they had to fulfill or face penalties. Ernest's camp was producing just enough to meet those obligations, but barely. Mae scanned the filing. The company had been hemorrhaging money, owing creditors, facing bankruptcy. Keeping a winter camp operational was expensive. Supplies, wages, maintaining equipment in harsh conditions. From a purely financial standpoint, abandoning the crew made a cold kind of sense. "They chose money over lives," Mae said flatly. "That's what it looks like." Phyllis pulled out another file. "And here's the worst part. After the men died, after the company claimed it was a tragic accident, Crowling Timber declared bankruptcy and dissolved in 1957. Vernon Hartley and the other investors walked away. Some of them started new ventures. No one was ever held accountable. Mae gathered copies of everything, her collection of evidence growing. She'd expected to find negligence, perhaps incompetence. What she was uncovering was something darker. Calculated decisions to prioritize profit over human life, followed by a careful cover-up. That night at the cabin, Mae couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about Ernest, 25 years old, watching his supplies dwindle, rationing food, trying to keep 22 men alive. He must have written to the company, must have sent messages requesting help. The manifest proved the supplies existed. They'd simply been sent elsewhere. Mae rose and searched the cabin again, looking for any correspondence Ernest might have kept. She found nothing at first, but then she remembered the chimney. Old cabins sometimes had hiding places in the stonework, gaps where stones had been deliberately left loose. She examined the chimney carefully, tapping stones, looking for movement. On the left side, about chest height, one stone shifted under pressure. Mae worked it free and reached into the cavity behind it. Her fingers touched paper, an envelope, protected from moisture by the stone. Mae pulled it out with shaking hands. The envelope was addressed to Crowling Timber Company, Vernon Hartley, Director of Operations. It had never been sent. Inside was a letter in Ernest's handwriting. Mr. Hartley, this is the 4th message I've sent requesting emergency supplies. We received no delivery on January 15th, as scheduled. We are now into our 3rd week of severe rationing. The men are hungry and cold. We've burned most of the furniture to stay warm. The weather has been too severe to attempt walking out, but if supplies don't arrive soon, we'll have no choice. I am responsible for these men, and I'm begging for immediate assistance. Whatever our production numbers, these are human lives. Please send help. Ernest Crowling, foreman. The letter was dated January 20th, 1953, 4 days before the 11 men had tried to walk to Prospect. Ernest had written it, but there was no way to send it. The camp was cut off, snowed in. He'd kept it, perhaps hoping to send it when the pass cleared, or perhaps as evidence of what he'd tried to do. Mae felt tears on her cheeks. Ernest had done everything right. He'd been responsible, careful, pleading for help, and he'd been ignored. Sacrificed along with his crew for the sake of profit margins and cost reduction. She thought about her grandmother, Elizabeth, losing her brother to corporate greed. No wonder the family had never talked about it. What could you say? How could you make sense of such senseless death? Mae carried Ernest's letter to the kitchen table and added it to her growing archive. She now had proof of company knowledge, proof of deliberate resource redirection, and proof that Ernest had desperately requested help that never came. But she needed more. She needed to understand the full scope of the cover-up, needed to know who else had been involved and how they'd managed to bury the truth so completely. As dawn broke over the mountains, Mae made a decision. She would take everything she'd found, every document, every photograph, every carved message, and she would expose the complete story. Not just for Ernest and the 22 men who died with him, but for her grandmother, who'd carried silent grief her whole life. For her mother, who'd inherited that silence. And for herself, who'd spent a lifetime avoiding connection to the past. The walls had eyes. Ernest had made sure of that. His carved testimony had waited 70 years for someone to read it, to understand it, to act on it. Mae would be that someone. She would give Ernest and his men the justice they'd been denied. The hidden letter changed everything. Mae found it while examining the stone chimney more thoroughly, looking for additional hiding places Ernest might have used. Another loose stone, higher up this time, near where the chimney met the roof beam. Behind it was a sealed envelope, its paper brittle with age, but still intact. The envelope was addressed simply, "To whoever finds this." Mae carried it to the table with reverent hands. She opened it carefully, conscious that she might be the first person to read these words since Ernest wrote them 70 years ago. The letter was several pages long, written in Ernest's careful hand. "If you're reading this, then someone finally came. I prayed someone would, though I won't live to see it. My name is Ernest Huxley Crowling. I was the foreman of this winter logging camp for Crowling Timber Company. 22 men were placed under my care. I have failed them all. We were supposed to receive supply deliveries every 4 weeks through the winter. The November shipment came on time. The December shipment arrived 2 weeks late and was only half what we'd been promised. The January shipment never came at all. I sent messages by radio requesting emergency supplies. I was told the trucks were delayed by weather. I was told to ration carefully. I was told help was coming. I believed them because I had to. These men trusted me to keep them safe. On January 24th, 11 men voted to try walking to Prospect. I advised against it. The pass was snowed in, the temperature was 20 below, and the distance was 40 miles through mountain terrain. But they were desperate, and I couldn't stop them. I gave them what food I could spare and watched them leave. They never came back. The remaining 12 of us waited. We rationed everything: food, fuel, hope. We burned the furniture, then the wall's interior boards, anything that would keep us warm. We carved our names on these walls so someone would know we were here, so our families would know we existed. By February, men were too weak to work. By mid-February, they began dying. First William Ross, then James Garrett, then others. I carved their names and the dates. I wanted to remember each one properly. I am the last one alive as I write this. I stayed because someone had to tell the story. Someone had to make sure the truth didn't die with us. The company abandoned us. I found documents proving they redirected our supplies to other camps. We were sacrificed for cost savings. Vernon Hartley, the operations director, made the decision. He knew we were here, knew we were starving, and chose profit over our lives. I'm writing this testimony and hiding it where I hope it will be preserved. I'm carving everything I can on these walls. Names, dates, what happened. This cabin is our memorial. Please don't let us be forgotten. Tell my sister Elizabeth I tried. Tell her I did everything I could. Tell the families of these 22 men that they were brave and strong, and they deserved better than they got from this company. Tell everyone what happened here. Make them remember. Make them care. We weren't just workers. We were fathers and sons and brothers. We had names. We had lives that mattered. Please tell our story. Ernest Huxley Crowling, February 14th, 1953. Mae read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face. By the 3rd reading, her grief had transformed into something harder, sharper. Ernest had done everything right. He'd protected his men as long as he could, documented the truth, and died, hoping someone would care enough to listen. She would not let that hope be in vain. Mae stood and walked through the cabin, reading every carved message with new eyes. These weren't just historical artifacts. They were Ernest's final act of love for the men under his care. Every name was a life he'd honored. Every date was a death he'd mourned. Every message was his refusal to let corporate greed erase their existence. Near the bedroom window, she found something she'd missed before. Carved small, almost hidden, "Tell Elizabeth I tried." Mae broke then, really broke, for the first time since arriving at the cabin. She sat on the floor and sobbed for her great-uncle, who'd died alone trying to do the right thing. For her grandmother, who'd lost her brother and never spoke of it. For her mother, who'd inherited that silence and passed it on. And for herself, who'd spent 62 years avoiding any kind of deep connection, only to find the most profound connection of her life in a dead man's testimony. When the tears finally stopped, Mae felt something shift inside her. She'd spent 30 years in fire towers because watching from a distance felt safe. Ernest had watched, too, watched his men die one by one, unable to save them. But he hadn't turned away. He'd stayed. He'd borne witness. He'd carved the truth into wood so someone someday would know. Mae could do no less. She gathered every piece of evidence she'd collected and organized it methodically. Documents proving the company redirected supplies. Ernest's unsent letter requesting help. His final testimony hidden in the chimney. The ledger showing all 23 names. Photographs of the wall carvings. Her own notes mapping out the timeline. She created a comprehensive record of what had happened in the winter of 1952-1953, not just the facts, but the humanity behind them. She researched each of the 23 men, their hometowns, their families, what little she could find about their lives. They deserved to be remembered as whole people, not just names on a list. Lyle Schneider, age 32, from Montana. Married with 3 children, James Garrett, age 28, from Wyoming. Engaged to be married in the spring. William Ross, age 45, from Idaho. 5 children, the youngest just 2 years old. Each name carried a story. Each death had rippled out, devastating families, leaving questions that had never been answered. Mae felt the weight of their stories, the responsibility Ernest had carried and now passed to her. She worked late into the nights, often talking to Ernest as she wrote. "I understand why you stayed now. I understand what you were trying to do. You wanted them remembered not as statistics, but as men who mattered. I'll make sure they are. The cabin no longer felt haunted or unsettling. It felt sacred. Ernest had turned it into a memorial, and Mae was becoming its keeper, the one who would finally bring his testimony into the light. One evening, as she reviewed her notes, Mae found herself thinking about her own life choices. 30 years of isolation. No marriage, no children, no deep friendships. She'd convinced herself solitude was strength, that independence meant not needing anyone. But Ernest's final days showed her the truth. Connection mattered. Memory mattered. Being witnessed by others, having your existence acknowledged and valued, that mattered more than anything. Ernest had recognized that in his last days. He'd carved 22 names because he couldn't bear the thought of them being forgotten. He'd stayed alive, suffering to preserve their memory. Mae had spent her life avoiding the very thing Ernest had died protecting, the bond between people, the responsibility we carry for each other, the importance of telling each other's stories. I won't make that mistake anymore, Mae said to the silent cabin. I won't hide up in towers watching from a distance. I'll tell your story, Ernest. I'll tell all their stories. And maybe in doing that, I'll finally learn how to be part of the world, instead of just observing it. The cabin creaked its evening song, wood settling after the day's warmth. Mae lit candles. She'd started keeping candles burning in the evenings, a light against the darkness Ernest had worked in, and continued her research. She would finish what Ernest started. She would break the silence her family had maintained for 70 years, and she would make sure that Vernon Hartley and everyone else involved in the cover-up were finally held accountable, even if only by history's judgment. The walls had eyes. Ernest had made sure of it. Now Mae would make sure those eyes were finally seen. Mae found the second ledger purely by accident. She'd been examining the walls for structural integrity, concerned about the sections where Ernest had carved deeply into the wood. She pressed against a board near the bedroom doorway, testing its strength, and it shifted slightly. Not loose, deliberately movable. Mae's pulse quickened. She'd learned to recognize Ernest's hiding places. He'd been systematic, creating caches throughout the cabin. This felt similar. She worked the board carefully, easing it forward until it came free, revealing a hollow space in the wall. Inside was a leather-bound book, smaller than the camp ledger, but obviously well used. Mae carried it to the table and opened it by lamplight. Private Journal of Vernon Hartley, read the first page. Property of Crowling Timber Company, Operations Director, confidential. Mae's breath caught. This was Vernon Hartley's personal diary. The man who'd redirected the supplies, who'd made the decisions that killed Ernest and his crew. What was it doing hidden in the cabin's walls? She turned pages carefully, reading entries from 1951 and 1952. Most were mundane, meeting notes, production figures, complaints about labor costs. But as she read further, a pattern emerged. Hartley was obsessed with the company's finances, with cutting costs, with maximizing profit regardless of consequences. Then she reached an entry from November 1952 that made her stomach turn. The winter camp problem requires creative solution. Cannot afford to maintain full supply chain through spring. Billings camp showing 35% better yield per dollar invested. Recommendation: redirect winter supplies to Billings. Winter camp crew to be naturally reduced by attrition. Insurance policies secured on all personnel last month. If losses occur, company stands to recover costs plus additional funds. Harsh but necessary for survival of business. Mae read the entry again, unable to believe what she was seeing. Hartley hadn't just abandoned the men through negligence. He'd planned it. He'd taken out life insurance policies on all 23 workers, then deliberately withheld supplies, counting on natural attrition, death, to provide insurance payouts that would help the failing company. This wasn't negligence. This was premeditated murder for profit. She continued reading, horror mounting with each page. December entries showed Hartley coordinating with an insurance adjuster, discussing expected losses and payout timelines. January entries revealed his cold calculations, how many men might try to walk out, what percentage would likely die, how much the company would gain from their deaths versus the cost of keeping them alive. An entry from February 1953 confirmed the worst. No contact from winter camp since January radio transmission. Assume situation resolved per projections. Will initiate search and recovery operations in spring, once pass clears. Timing critical. Must claim bodies found before decomposition obscures actual time of death. Insurance adjuster Brennan advises waiting until July for maximum documentation clarity. Summer discovery more believable than immediate spring find. Mae felt bile rise in her throat. Hartley had known the men were dying. He'd waited deliberately, timing the discovery to maximize insurance claims while obscuring the actual timeline of deaths. She paged forward frantically, finding more evidence. Insurance documents showed policies taken out on all 23 men just 2 months before winter camp operations began. Correspondence between Hartley and insurance adjusters discussed operational losses in language that made death sound like a business expense. A letter from the insurance company, dated August 1953, confirmed payments totaling over $300,000, a fortune in 1953, distributed to Crowling Timber Company for the accidental deaths of 23. Workers.Mae found a manifest showing that the insurance money had been used to pay company debts and fund new ventures. The men's deaths had literally saved the company from immediate bankruptcy, but the most damning evidence was a letter dated March 1953. From Hartley to someone named Richard Brennan, winter situation completely contained. All personnel confirmed lost. Bodies will be recovered when accessible, but timeline works in our favor. By July, physical evidence will support tragic accident narrative. Families will be told workers attempted unauthorized winter departure against company advice. Insurance proceeds will sustain operations through restructuring. Total success, losses converted to assets. Future operations will avoid similar complications by maintaining only seasonal camps. Mae sat back, shaking. This wasn't a tragedy. It wasn't even negligence. It was calculated murder disguised as business decision-making. Vernon Hartley had deliberately killed 23 men for insurance money, then covered it up as an unfortunate accident. She thought about Ernest, dying in this cabin, carving testimony into the walls. Had he known? Had he suspected the company's betrayal was deliberate rather than incompetent? Then Mae found Ernest's name in Hartley's journal in an entry from February 1953. Crowling's sister Elizabeth has been making inquiries. She received no response to her letters to the camp and is demanding information. Have told her that weather has disrupted communications. Camp is fine. Her brother will contact her when pass clears. She is persistent and problematic. Note, after situation resolves, ensure she receives nothing that could raise questions. The foreman was her brother. Potential for family legal action if she discovers truth. Ernest Crowling must be documented as dying with the others. No special circumstances. Clean closure. Mae's hands trembled. Hartley had lied to her grandmother. Elizabeth had tried to reach Ernest, had sensed something was wrong, and had been deliberately deceived. Then after Ernest's death, she'd been told he died in a tragic accident, same as the others. Clean closure. No questions. No wonder Elizabeth had never spoken about her brother. She'd been lied to, stonewalled, and left with grief she couldn't fully process because she'd never been told the truth. Mae continued reading, finding more details of the cover-up. Hartley had coordinated with local authorities, paying for favorable reports. He'd pressured newspapers to limit coverage. He'd ensured that the search and recovery operation in July was brief and that all bodies were quickly buried with minimal examination. The death certificates Mae had seen, including Ernest's, dated July with cause of death listed as exposure, were all falsified. The men had died in February and March, but their deaths were officially recorded months later to support the cover-up timeline. An entry from September 1953 showed Hartley's satisfaction with the outcome. Winter camp matter fully resolved. Insurance proceeds received and distributed. Families compensated with small payments, all signed releases, preventing future legal action. Press coverage contained and concluded. No investigations pending. Company reputation intact. Consider operation a complete success. Converted potential bankruptcy into solvency through creative asset management. Mae felt rage burn through her chest, hot and clean. 23 men had died, her own great-uncle among them, and Vernon Hartley had considered it a complete success. He'd murdered them for money, covered it up systematically, and felt proud of his creative asset management. She looked around the cabin with new understanding. Ernest must have suspected something. Why else would he have hidden documents, carved testimony so extensively, left multiple caches of evidence? He'd known it wasn't just bad luck or weather. He'd known the company had abandoned them deliberately, and somehow Ernest had gotten hold of Hartley's journal. Mae paged to the front, looking for clues. There, written in Ernest's handwriting on the inside cover, found in company office during December supply pickup, kept as evidence of betrayal. May God forgive them, for I cannot. H.C. Ernest had discovered the truth. He'd found Hartley's journal during the December supply run, before the winter locked them in. He'd read about the plan to abandon the camp, to let them die for insurance money. And he'd hidden the journal in the cabin's walls, preserving the evidence of murder. Mae felt tears on her cheeks again, but this time they were tears of fury. Ernest had known he was being deliberately killed. He'd known the company wasn't coming to save them. And he'd still stayed, still carved the testimony, still tried to preserve the truth for someone to find someday. She thought about her grandmother, Elizabeth, losing her brother and never knowing why, never knowing that his death was murder, not accident. Living with questions she couldn't answer because everyone involved had lied to her. 3 generations of women carrying silent grief because Vernon Hartley had decided 23 lives were worth less than insurance money. Mae stood and walked to Ernest's vinyl-carved message. "Tell them we were here. I will tell them." Mae said aloud, her voice hard with determination. "But I'll tell them everything, Ernest. Not just that you were here, but how you died. Who killed you? Why they did it. I'll expose every lie, every cover-up, every person who profited from your murder. I promise you that." She gathered the journal carefully, adding it to her archive. This changed everything. She thought she was documenting a historical tragedy. Now she understood she was gathering evidence of murder, premeditated, calculated, covered up for 70 years. Vernon Hartley had been dead for decades. Mae had found his obituary in her research, dated 1989, but his crime had never been exposed. The families of the 23 men had never known the truth. They'd accepted the lie of tragic accident and moved on with their grief. Mae would give them truth. She would expose the conspiracy. And she would make sure Vernon Hartley's name was forever associated with the word murderer, even if he'd escaped earthly justice. The walls had eyes. Ernest had made sure of it. Now those eyes would bear witness not just to tragedy, but to murder. And Mae would be the voice that finally spoke their testimony aloud. Mae found the film canister 2 days after discovering Hartley's journal. She'd been examining the rafters, thinking about Ernest's methodical approach to hiding evidence. If she were documenting a crime, wanting to preserve proof beyond written testimony, what would she use? In 1953, that meant film. The canister was wedged between 2 roof beams, wrapped in oilcloth and carefully secured. Mae climbed on the table to reach it, her heart pounding. The metal was rusted but intact. She brought it down carefully and opened it by lamplight. Inside was a reel of 8mm film, the kind used in personal cameras of that era. Mae held it up to the light, seeing individual frames, tiny images of men, of the cabin interior, of snow. Ernest had filmed something. The question was what, and whether the film was still viable after 70 years. Mae needed help. She needed equipment to view the film, and she needed witnesses. This evidence was too important to examine alone. She drove to Prospect the next morning, the film canister on the seat beside her. Villis looked up when Mae walked into the library, immediately sensing something had changed. "I found something," Mae said without preamble. "Something that changes everything. Can we talk privately?" In the library's small back office, Mae laid out what she'd discovered. Hartley's journal, the insurance documents, the evidence of premeditated murder. Phyllis read in silence, her face growing pale. "Dear God," the librarian whispered. "This is proof of mass murder and a 70-year cover-up." Mae showed her the film canister. "Ernest documented everything. I need to see what's on this film. Do you have equipment that can play it?" Phyllis nodded slowly. "We have an old 8mm projector in the basement. Historical Society donated it years ago for archiving old family films. I haven't used it in a decade, but it should still work." She looked at Mae seriously. "If this film shows what I think it does, you need more than just me as a witness. You need documentation. You need credibility. What are you suggesting?" "A public presentation. Here at the library. Invite media, Historical Society members, anyone who'll listen. Show them everything, the documents, the film, the wall carvings through your photographs. Make it impossible to ignore or bury again." Mae felt a flutter of anxiety. Public speaking had never been her strength. 30 years alone in fire towers didn't prepare someone for standing in front of crowds. But Phyllis was right. This story needed witnesses. It needed to be heard publicly, documented, impossible to dismiss. "Give me a week," Mae said. "I need to organize everything properly. Make sure I can present it clearly." "I'll spread the word," Phyllis agreed. "And Mae, be prepared for resistance. People in this town have lived with the official story for 70 years. Some won't want it challenged." Over the next week, Mae worked obsessively. She created a comprehensive timeline of events, supported by documentation. She organized her photographs of the wall carvings into a logical sequence. She made copies of every crucial document: Hartley's journal entries, insurance records, Ernest's letters, the supply manifest. She researched the families of the 23 men, finding addresses for descendants where possible. She also made multiple copies of everything and stored them in different locations. If someone tried to suppress this story again, they'd have to destroy evidence in a dozen places. Phyllis called 3 days before the presentation. "Mae, you need to know. Word has spread. We've got regional media confirmed, state historical society representatives, and over 60 people have said they're coming. This is bigger than I expected." Mae's stomach tightened with nerves, but she pushed them aside. Ernest had died preserving this testimony. The least she could do was speak it aloud. The morning of the presentation, Mae returned to the cabin one final time. She wanted to check the film canister storage one more time, make sure she hadn't missed any evidence Ernest might have left. That's when she found the quilt. It was in a cedar chest under the bedroom window. A chest Mae had opened before, but assumed was empty because it had been so light. But she'd never examined the bottom, where a false panel concealed a hidden compartment. Inside was a quilt, carefully folded. Mae lifted it out and spread it across the bed. It was made from scraps of fabric, pieces of clothing, she realized. Work shirts, flannel, denim, and embroidered on each square was a name and hometown: Lyle Schneider. Montana, James Garrett, Wyoming, William Ross, Idaho. All 23 men were represented, each square a memorial to one life. The stitching was rough but careful, the work of men with calloused hands trying to create something meaningful in their final days. Mae sat on the edge of the bed, the quilt in her lap, and wept. These men had known they were dying. They'd taken pieces of their own clothing and sewn them together, creating a memorial for themselves. Hoping someone would find it, hoping someone would remember them as more than names on a list. She understood then what Ernest had been trying to do with all his hiding places, all his carved testimony. He'd been creating a memorial that couldn't be destroyed. Multiple forms of evidence, written, carved, filmed, sewn, scattered throughout the cabin. Even if someone found and destroyed one piece, others would remain. Ernest had turned the entire cabin into a monument to 23 lives. Mae carefully folded the quilt and packed it with her other evidence. This would be the centerpiece of her presentation, visual, tangible proof of the men's humanity and hope. The drive to Prospect felt longer than usual. Mae rehearsed her presentation mentally, organizing her thoughts. She had to get this right, not just for Ernest and the 22 others, but for their families. For her grandmother, for everyone who'd been lied to for 70 years, the library's meeting room was already crowded when she arrived. Mae had expected maybe 30 people. There were at least 70, with more arriving. Media cameras set up in back, historical society members with notebooks, and faces Mae didn't recognize. Could some of them be descendants? Phyllis met her at the door. "You ready?" "No," Mae admitted. "But I'm doing this anyway." "That's the spirit." Phyllis squeezed her arm. "You're giving voice to men who've been silent for 70 years. Ernest would be proud." Mae set up her presentation materials at the front of the room. The quilt went on display first, draped over a stand Phyllis had arranged. People were already gathering around it, reading the embroidered names. As the appointed hour arrived, Mae stood at the front and looked out at the assembled crowd. She saw curiosity, skepticism, interest. She took a deep breath. "My name is Mae Huxley," she began, her voice steadier than she felt. 3 months ago, I bought a cabin in these mountains. I thought I was buying a quiet place to retire. Instead, I bought a crime scene that had been hidden for 70 years. She displayed the first photograph, Ernest, standing with his crew in front of the cabin, all of them smiling. "This is my great-uncle Ernest Huxley Crowling, and 22 other men. In the winter of 1953, they all died in that cabin. For 70 years, their deaths have been called a tragic accident. I'm here to tell you the truth. They were murdered." The room went silent. Mae continued, walking through her evidence methodically. The supply manifest showing redirected provisions. Hartley's journal entries planning the abandonment. The insurance documents revealing the profit motive. Ernest's letters begging for help that never came. She showed photographs of the wall carvings, reading Ernest's carved journal entries aloud. She explained how Ernest had hidden evidence throughout the cabin, how he'd spent his final days creating a memorial that couldn't be erased. "Ernest knew he was dying," Mae said, her voice breaking slightly. "He knew the company had abandoned them deliberately, and he made sure the truth would survive, even if he didn't." She held up the brass compass. "This belonged to Ernest. I found it in the ashes behind the cabin. He tried to burn company documents at some point, but he kept this, a reminder of who he was, what he'd tried to do." Mae showed them Ernest's final letter, reading it aloud to the silent room. By the time she finished, several people were crying openly. Then she brought out the film canister. "Ernest documented everything with film. I haven't viewed it yet. I wanted witnesses when we saw it for the first time. What we're about to watch is 70-year-old testimony from men who knew they were dying." Phyllis dimmed the lights and started the old projector. The film was grainy, jumping occasionally, but remarkably preserved. It began with footage of the men at work, felling trees, hauling logs, laughing together. Young men strong and vital. The camera panned across faces, lingering on each one, as if Ernest wanted to capture their humanity. Then the footage shifted. The men looked thinner, their faces drawn. The cabin interior appeared, showing the dwindling food supplies, the furniture being broken up for firewood. Ernest's voice came through faintly on the film, though the words were hard to make out. But his meaning was clear. He was documenting their deterioration, their suffering. One sequence showed the 11 men preparing to leave, bundling up against the cold. They waved at the camera, trying to smile. Ernest had filmed their departure, knowing he might be recording their final moments. The last frames were the hardest to watch. Ernest had propped up the camera somehow, filming himself. His face was gaunt, his eyes exhausted but determined. He pointed to the walls, showing the carved testimony. He held up documents, the supply manifest, company memos. He was creating a visual record that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. The final image was Ernest's face, staring directly into the camera, into the future, at whoever would eventually watch this. His lips moved, forming words the old film couldn't capture. But Mae understood. She'd read his letters, his carved testimony. She knew what he was saying. Remember us. Tell our story. Don't let them win. The film ended. The room remained silent for a long moment. Then slowly people began to react. Mae saw tears, anger, shock. A woman in the third row stood up. "My grandmother was Lyle Schneider's daughter," she said, her voice shaking. "All my life I was told my grandfather died in a logging accident. that it was quick, that he didn't suffer. You're saying that wasn't true? Mae met her eyes. I'm saying he died trying to save himself and his crew. I'm saying he was brave. And I'm saying the company lied about how and why he died. I'm sorry you had to learn the truth this way. Others stood, identifying themselves as descendants. 8 in total from different families. All of them had been told the same lie. Tragic accident, no one to blame, just bad luck and harsh weather. A journalist from the regional paper raised his hand. You have documentation to support all of this? Copies we can verify? I have copies of everything, Mae said. And the original documents are secured in multiple locations. I also have the cabin itself. The walls where Ernest carved his testimony are still there. Anyone who wants to see them is welcome. I'm donating the property to the Historical Society to be preserved as a memorial. Phyllis stood. The Historical Society accepts. We'll work with Mae to ensure the cabin is preserved exactly as Ernest left it. It's a historical site now, a testament to corporate negligence and one man's determination to tell the truth. The meeting continued for another hour. Journalists asked questions. Historical Society members discussed preservation plans. Descendants shared what they knew of their family stories, piecing together how the lie had been maintained for so long. Mae found herself surrounded by people afterward. The descendants especially wanted to thank her, to see the photographs more closely, to touch the quilt their grandfathers and great-grandfathers had sewn. The woman who'd identified herself as Schneider's granddaughter approached Mae privately. "Thank you," she said simply. "My grandmother never talked about what happened. She died 10 years ago, still wondering why her husband hadn't come home. At least now we know. At least now we can honor his real story." Mae felt the weight of responsibility settle more firmly on her shoulders. This wasn't just about exposing the past. It was about giving families closure, about honoring the dead properly, about making sure their real stories, not sanitized corporate lies, were what survived. As the crowd dispersed, a younger man approached. He introduced himself as a lawyer with the State Attorney General's office. "What happened here may have been 70 years ago," he said, "but some of the insurance companies involved still exist. There might be grounds for civil action on behalf of the families. Would you be willing to provide your evidence to our office?" "Absolutely," Mae said. "Whatever it takes to get justice for these men, even if it's 70 years late." Driving back to the cabin that evening, Mae felt exhausted, but lighter somehow. She'd done what Ernest had hoped someone would do. She'd told the story. She'd exposed the lies. And people had listened. At the cabin, Mae lit her usual evening candles and sat at the kitchen table. She looked at the walls, at Ernest's carved testimony, and spoke aloud. "I kept my promise, Ernest. Everyone knows now. Your sister's granddaughter made sure of it. The men will be remembered properly. Their real story will be told. You succeeded. The truth survived." The cabin settled around her with its familiar evening sounds. Mae felt a peace she hadn't known in months. The responsibility was still there. She'd committed to being the cabin's caretaker, to continuing to share the story, but the hardest part was done. The walls had eyes, and finally, people had seen what they witnessed. Ernest's 70-year testimony had been heard. The murdered men would be remembered not as statistics or unfortunate accidents, but as human beings who deserved better than they got, and Vernon Hartley's name would forever be associated with the word Mae had spoken publicly: murderer. Even in death, he would finally face judgment for what he'd done. The presentation had taken on a life of its own. What Mae had planned as a single evening of testimony turned into something larger. The regional media coverage sparked state and then national interest. Within 2 weeks, journalists from major newspapers were calling. Television crews requested permission to film the cabin. The story of the murdered, loggers and Ernest's 70-year testimony, captured public attention in a way Mae hadn't anticipated. But the real impact came from the descendants. In the weeks following the library presentation, Mae heard from 19 families, descendants of 17 of the 23 men. They'd seen the news coverage, read the articles, and reached out. Some had suspected the official story wasn't complete. Others were shocked to learn their grandfathers hadn't simply died in an accident. Phyllis helped coordinate, and together they planned a memorial ceremony at the cabin. It would be held on the anniversary of Ernest's death, February 14th. All descendants were invited. The Historical Society would unveil plans for preserving the site, and Mae would formally transfer the property deed. As the date approached, Mae found herself preparing the cabin for visitors. She cleaned carefully, preserving Ernest's carvings but making the space safe and accessible. She created a walking tour guide explaining each carved entry, each piece of testimony. She wanted people to understand not just what had happened, but who these men had been. The morning of February 14th dawned cold and clear. Mae had worried about weather. February in Wyoming could be brutal, but the sky was blue and the roads passable. By mid-morning, cars began arriving. Descendants, some traveling from multiple states, Historical Society members, media, even some locals from Prospect who'd finally decided to bear witness to history they'd long ignored. Mae stood on the cabin's porch, greeting people as they arrived. She'd worried about being overwhelmed by crowds after years of solitude, but instead she felt a strange rightness. These people belonged here. Their ancestors had died here. This was their pilgrimage as much as her memorial. The memorial quilt was displayed on the porch railing, each embroidered name visible. People gathered around it, finding their relatives' names, taking photographs, some reaching out to touch the fabric their grandfathers had sewn. An elderly woman approached Mae with tears streaming down her face. "I'm Lyle Schneider's granddaughter, the woman who spoke at the library." She gestured to the quilt. "This square, this was his work shirt. I recognize the pattern. My grandmother had a photograph of him wearing it. He cut up his own shirt to make this memorial." Mae clasped the woman's hands. "He wanted to be remembered. They all did. That's why they made this. Thank you for finding it. Thank you for telling the truth." The woman's voice broke. "My grandmother died, never knowing what really happened to him. But at least now we know. At least now we can honor his real story." More people approached with similar gratitude. A man whose great-grandfather had been among the 11 who tried to walk out. A woman whose grandfather had died in the cabin itself. Each family had lived with incomplete information, with questions that couldn't be answered, with grief that couldn't fully resolve because the truth had been hidden. Now they had answers. Painful answers, but real ones. At noon, the formal ceremony began. Phyllis spoke first, explaining the Historical Society's commitment to preserving the cabin exactly as Ernest had left it. The carved testimony would be protected, documented, and made accessible to researchers and descendants. A representative from the State Historical Commission announced that the cabin would be designated an official historical landmark. A bronze plaque would be installed, listing all 23 names and explaining what had happened. Then it was Mae's turn to speak. She stood before the assembled crowd, nearly 40 people, and felt the weight of what she was about to do. "3 months ago, I thought I was buying a place to hide," Mae began. "I'd spent 30 years alone in fire towers, watching from a distance, avoiding connection. I came here thinking isolation was peace. I was wrong." She gestured to the cabin. "Ernest Crowling and 22 other men died here because a corporation valued profit over human life. They were abandoned deliberately, left to starve, and then their deaths were covered up and lied about for 70 years. That's the truth of what happened." Mae's voice strengthened. "But Ernest made sure it wasn't the end of the story. He carved testimony into these walls. He hid evidence throughout the cabin. He filmed what was happening. He created a memorial that couldn't be erased. He turned this cabin into a witness that would outlast any cover-up." She looked at the descendants. "Your grandfathers and great-grandfathers were brave men who deserved better than they got. They weren't just victims. They were fathers and husbands and sons who fought to survive, who hoped for rescue, who supported each other to the end. The quilt they made shows that they faced death with dignity and courage." Mae pulled out Ernest's signet ring, which she'd found in the cabin's ashes. The Crowling family crest was still visible on the tarnished gold. This belonged to Ernest. "My great-uncle, my grandmother's brother. He wore it as a symbol of his family, his responsibility. He died wearing it, trying to fulfill that responsibility to the men under his care. She placed the ring on the memorial table beside the quilt. "I'm leaving it here as part of the memorial, a symbol that someone from the family finally acknowledged the truth, finally honored these men the way they should have been honored 70 years ago." The ceremony continued with a moment of silence for each of the 23 men. Their names were read aloud, one by one, followed by whatever information their descendants could provide. It transformed them from names on a list to real people with real lives. When all 23 had been honored, Mae invited people to tour the cabin in small groups to see Ernest's carved testimony firsthand. She guided them through, explaining each entry, each hidden cache, each piece of evidence Ernest had preserved. People stood in silence, reading the carved words, touching the walls, absorbing the weight of what had happened here. This wasn't just history. It was a sacred space, a memorial created by dying men for future generations. After the cabin tours, the gathering moved back outside. The afternoon sun was warm despite the February cold, and people lingered, reluctant to leave. Descendants talked among themselves, sharing family stories, comparing what they'd been told versus what they now knew. Connections formed between families who'd never met, but whose histories were forever linked by tragedy. Mae found herself at the center of quiet conversations. A middle-aged man approached her, introducing himself as William Ross's great-grandson. "My great-grandfather had 5 children," he said. "The youngest was my grandmother. She was only 2 when he died. She grew up without knowing him, and she spent her whole life wondering about him. She died 5 years ago, still with questions. I wish she could have known the truth, known that he didn't just abandon them, that he fought to survive, that he died trying to get home." "She knew he loved her," Mae said gently. "That's what matters. The rest is just filling in details." "Maybe, but the details matter too. Knowing he was murdered, not careless, that matters. Knowing someone deliberately killed him for profit, that changes how we remember him. He was a victim of a crime, not just bad luck." Others echoed similar sentiments. The truth, however painful, was better than the sanitized lie they'd lived with. Their relatives had been wronged twice, first by being murdered, then by having their deaths misrepresented as accidents. Phyllis gathered everyone for a final announcement. "The Historical Society has established a memorial fund," she explained. "We'll be creating a permanent exhibit about the winter camp tragedy. We're also commissioning a bronze memorial plaque to be installed here at the cabin. It will list all 23 names and tell the true story of what happened." She gestured to Mae. "Mae has agreed to serve as the site's caretaker and historical consultant. She'll continue to preserve Ernest's testimony and guide tours for descendants, researchers, and anyone who wants to understand this piece of history." Spontaneous applause broke out. Mae felt her face flush. She'd gone from seeking isolation to becoming the keeper of a story that needed telling. The irony wasn't lost on her. "I have one more thing to share," Mae said when the applause died down. She pulled out a folder she'd prepared. "In researching the insurance fraud, I discovered that one of the companies involved still exists under a different name. A lawyer with the State Attorney General's office believes there may be grounds for civil action. It won't bring anyone back, but it might result in compensation for the families and public acknowledgement of the crime." She distributed copies of the information to the descendants. "This is your decision, not mine. But I wanted you to know the option exists. If you want justice, or at least acknowledgement, there may be a path forward." Several descendants immediately expressed interest. Others wanted time to think, to discuss with their families. But the possibility of legal action, of officially calling this what it was, murder for profit, clearly resonated. As the afternoon wore on, people began to leave, but not before each descendant approached Mae personally. Some thanked her. Some shared stories about their relatives. Some simply stood with her in silence, acknowledging the weight of what had been uncovered. The woman who was Lyle Schneider's granddaughter was among the last to leave. She handed Mae an old photograph. "This is my grandfather, taken in 1950, before he came to work for Crowling Timber. He's smiling in this one. Happy. I want you to have it. For the memorial exhibit." Her voice caught. "Thank you for giving him back his story, for making sure people know he mattered." Mae accepted the photograph with careful hands. He did matter. They all did. That's why Ernest stayed. That's why he carved their names and recorded their stories. He knew they mattered. After everyone left, Mae stood alone on the cabin porch. The sun was setting, painting the mountains gold and purple. She thought about the journey that had brought her here. 30 years of isolation, of watching from a distance, of convincing herself that solitude was enough. Ernest had taught her differently. His carved testimony, his refusal to let these men be forgotten, his determination to preserve their humanity even in death, all of it showed that connection mattered more than isolation. That being witnessed, being remembered, being valued by others was what gave life meaning. Mae had spent decades alone. Now she was surrounded by a community of descendants, historians, journalists and locals who'd finally acknowledged the truth. She'd gone from observer to participant, from silent to speaking, and in the process, she'd found something she hadn't known she was looking for: purpose beyond survival, connection beyond solitude. She walked back into the cabin and lit her evening candles. The carved walls surrounded her, Ernest's testimony visible in the flickering light. Mae spoke aloud to him, as she often did now. "We did it, Ernest. We told your story. We honored your men. We exposed the lie. You succeeded. The truth survived. And it always will now. I'll make sure of that." The cabin creaked softly in the evening cold. Mae smiled, feeling at peace. She'd retired to these mountains seeking quiet. Instead, she'd found her voice, and she'd used it to speak for 23 men who'd been silenced for too long. Tomorrow, she'd begin work on the permanent exhibit. She'd organize the photographs, documents, and testimony into something accessible and educational. She'd train as a historical guide so she could share the cabin's story with future visitors. She'd continue the work Ernest had started 70 years ago, but tonight she simply sat with the satisfaction of knowing she'd kept her promise. The walls had eyes, and the world had finally seen what they witnessed. Ernest's testimony had been heard. The murdered men had been honored, and the truth, so long buried, had been brought into the light. Mae had thought retirement meant ending her watch. Instead, she'd simply changed towers, from watching for forest fires to watching over historical truth. And she'd discovered that some truths are worth any amount of time and effort to preserve. The candles burned steadily in the darkness. Outside, the mountains stood silent witness, and inside the cabin, carved into wood that would outlast them, all 23 names waited for the next person who would come to remember, to honor, to bear witness to lives that had mattered then and still mattered now. 3 months later, on a warm May morning, Mae stood beside the cabin as workers installed the bronze memorial plaque. It had taken weeks to get the wording right, to ensure every detail was accurate and respectful. Now it hung beside the front door, permanent and unmistakable, in memory of 23 men who died here in the winter of 1952-1953. Abandoned by their employer and left to starve, they faced death with courage and dignity. Ernest Huxley Crowling stayed to the end, recording their story on these walls so they would not be forgotten. We remember them. Ernest H. Crowling, Lyle Schneider, James Garrett, William Ross. The names continued, all 23 listed in careful bronze letters. At the bottom, they worked with honor, they died with courage. Ernest Crowling stayed to tell their story. We stay to remember. Mae traced the letters with her fingers, feeling the weight of those words. This plaque would be here long after she was gone. Future generations would read these names, learn this story, understand what had happened on this mountain. The Historical Society had done excellent work. The cabin was now officially preserved, its interior documented and protected. Mae had moved into the small outbuilding she'd renovated, leaving the cabin itself untouched as Ernest had left it. Visitors could tour by appointment, and Mae guided them through, explaining each carved entry, each piece of testimony. In the yet 3 months since the memorial ceremony, she'd given over 30 tours. Descendants continued to visit, bringing family photographs and stories to add to the growing archive. Researchers came to study the site. Students arrived on field trips, learning about corporate negligence and the importance of preserving historical truth. Mae had become something she'd never expected. A teacher, a guide, a keeper of memory, and she'd discovered she was good at it. Explaining Ernest's testimony, helping visitors understand the humanity behind the tragedy, connecting past to present, it gave her days purpose and meaning she'd never found in solitude. The legal case was progressing too. 8 families had joined together in a civil action against the successor insurance company. The case would take years, the lawyer had warned, but the evidence was strong. Hartley's journal, the insurance, documents, Ernest's testimony, it all pointed to deliberate fraud. Even if the families never saw financial compensation, the legal filing itself was a form of justice. Official acknowledgement that a crime had occurred, public record that couldn't be erased or denied. Mae walked through the cabin slowly, as she did most mornings. She'd memorized every carved entry by now, but she still read them, still honored each man's story. She'd learned more about each of them through descendants' research. Lyle Schneider had been a skilled woodworker who'd carved toys for his children. James Garrett had been engaged to marry his childhood sweetheart. William Ross had sung in his church choir. They'd been real people with real lives, not just names on a list. Ernest had understood that. That's why he'd carved not just their names, but details about them, their hometowns, their families, their dreams. In the bedroom, Mae paused at the window where Ernest had carved, "Tell Elizabeth I tried." She'd learned more about her grandmother in the past months than in her entire previous life. Phyllis had helped her find letters Elizabeth had written to the company in 1953, desperate for information about her brother. The letters had been ignored, filed away, deliberately unanswered. Elizabeth had died in 1985, never knowing the truth. That grieved Mae. Her grandmother had lived 32 years with unanswered questions, with grief she couldn't fully process. But at least now, 40 years after Elizabeth's death, her granddaughter had given Ernest the voice Elizabeth had wanted him to have. Mae had made peace with her own mother's silence too. Her mother had known fragments of the story, enough to know it was painful, not enough to understand it fully. She'd chosen not to dig deeper, perhaps to protect herself from grief. Mae couldn't fault her for that. Everyone dealt with pain differently, but Mae had chosen differently. She'd chosen to excavate the truth, no matter how painful, and in doing so she'd discovered something about herself. She was stronger than she'd thought, more capable of connection than she'd believed, better at speaking truth than she'd imagined. A car pulled up outside. Today's visitors. Mae recognized them from their correspondence. 2 sisters whose great-uncle had been among the 11 who'd tried to walk out. They'd traveled from Oregon to see where he'd spent his final days. Mae went out to greet them, carrying her folder of documents and photographs. This was her work now, not watching for fires from a lonely tower, but preserving memory, honoring the dead, ensuring truth survived. As she showed the sisters through the cabin, explaining Ernest's carved testimony and their great-uncle's bravery in attempting the winter journey, Mae felt the rightness of her purpose. She'd thought retirement meant ending her life's work. Instead, she'd simply found new work, more important work, perhaps, than she'd ever done. That evening, after the sisters left, Mae sat on the cabin's porch watching sunset paint the mountains. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, the classified ad for a remote cabin, the drive through mountain roads, the discovery of the carvings, the slow unraveling of a 70-year-old crime. She'd come here seeking peace through isolation. She'd found peace through purpose instead. Mae lit a candle in the window, as she did every evening, a light against the darkness Ernest had worked in, a symbol that his testimony was still being honored, still being shared, still mattering 7 decades after his death. The mountains stood silent around her, ancient and patient. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called its evening song. The forest breathed its green breath, and in the cabin behind her, carved into wood that would outlast generations, 23 names waited for tomorrow's visitors. Mae had spent 30 years watching over wilderness, protecting it from fire. Now she was watching over memory, protecting it from forgetting. Same essential work, different form. She thought about Ernest's final words carved into the wood. "Tell them we were here. I'm still telling them," Mae said aloud to the gathering dusk. "I'll keep telling them. That's my promise to you, Ernest. Your story won't end. Their names won't be forgotten. The truth will survive." The cabin settled behind her with its familiar evening sounds. Mae smiled. She'd come to these mountains thinking she'd found a place to hide. Instead, she'd found a place to stand, to speak, to matter. The walls had eyes, and Mae had become their voice, speaking for the dead, honoring their memory, ensuring their truth echoed forward through time. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything retirement was meant to be, not an ending, but a transformation into something new, something meaningful, something that would matter long after she was gone. Mae stood and walked back inside, closing the door gently behind her. Tomorrow would bring new visitors, new stories to share, new connections to make. But tonight, she was content to sit with the silence, with the candles, with the carved testimony surrounding her. The mountains kept their watch outside, and inside, Mae kept hers, guardian of memory, keeper of truth, voice for the voiceless. It was exactly where she was meant to be,